Hey everybody, Dr. Seagren here, and today we are going to be doing a virtual lab. And this virtual lab is going to be about rocks in different plate tectonic settings. And I'll kind of explain what that means, but it's going to be a little bit different. Instead of doing things live where it would just be me holding up different rocks to the camera, it would be very strange and awkward. We're going to do a virtual lab here in the format of an ed puzzle. And how ed puzzles work is that every once in a while, I will basically kind of freeze the video and ask you a question that you have to type in a response to. For example, so as the video plays, basically, it'll pop up questions automatically, and these questions are going to work alongside your lab worksheet. You don't have to write down the questions as you answer them on the computer, but it might be a good idea to kind of jot down some notes so that when you do your quiz in OnRamps, you can actually sort of have the answers there written out. So you don't have to try to go back into your answers in Edpuzzle. So I would recommend actually taking notes during this process. All right, so as I was saying, this is going to be a lab where basically we're going to talk about 4 different locations in the world. Each with a unique plate tectonic setting. For example, we'll talk about the Himalayan Mountains or the MidAtlantic Ridge or Texas or California, the Cascade Mountains. And we are going to look at some rock samples, and you're going to try to match the rock samples to the location. And so that's the idea of the lab. So to do that, we need to learn a little bit about the plate tectonics of these locations and a little bit about rocks. So let's get right into it. So here we go. This is going to be the rocks and tectonic settings. All right, so we're going to have some rock samples from these 4 settings. We're going to have the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the Cascade Mountains, the Himalayan Mountains, and the Llano uplift. Mid-Atlantic Ridge is in the Atlantic Ocean. Cascade Mountains are in California. Himalayan Mountains are over in Asia. That's Mount Everest, the highest mountains in the world. And the Llano uplift is sort of more towards like San Antonio area. All right, so for a big refresher on rocks, we have our 3 main types of rocks: igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic. And as a reminder, igneous rocks form from cooling lava. Igneous from the root word ignite, like fire rock. As a refresher, we have 2 different types of igneous rocks. We have intrusive and extrusive. Intrusive form underground. They cool slowly, and this results in large crystals forming typically in the rocks. Extrusive rocks form above ground, so when lava comes to the surface, it cools fast, and usually these are smoother looking and they have smaller crystals. Next, we have sedimentary rocks, which are formed from sediments such as mud and clay and sand and shells. Anything that's floating around in the water typically or being blown around by the air, that is sediment. And when the sediment piles up on top of each other year after year after year, it will eventually form layers of rock. These are typically formed in environments that contain lots of sediments, so think water, so rivers, lakes, oceans, beaches, swamps, deserts, those things. And sedimentary rocks, as you can see on the right there, usually are these layered rocks, which we have been talking about. We know that the oldest layers are going to typically be on the bottom and the youngest layers will be on the top. Metamorphic rocks are basically, those are formed from igneous or sedimentary rocks that are exposed to high heat and pressure. Generally, these are going to be found deeper within the earth where there's high heat and pressure, or in places where tectonic forces squeeze rocks together, such as mountains are typically where you're going to find the metamorphic rocks. And there is an example of a metamorphic rock on our right. You can see that the once flat layers have been smashed together and have formed these folds and bends in the rock. That's one thing to look out for metamorphic rocks. All right, so in this lab, we are going to get down to some actual specific kinds of rocks. You do not need to memorize every single one of these rocks, but I'm just going to go over each one. Our first rock is going to be Obsidian. It's probably the coolest looking rock of the bunch. This is an extrusive igneous rock. That means it cools above ground very quickly, and in the process, it forms this kind of black rock that is glass-like in appearance. And this is typically found on continents. This lava type is called felsic lava, and that is unique to continents. So we would expect to find this rock maybe on a volcano that is oozing out a lot of lava on a continent. Okay, cool. Rhyolite is another type of extrusive igneous rock. This is also formed from felsic lava. This is found in continents. It cools pretty close to the surface, not quite as fast as obsidian, and therefore it actually ends up being a slightly different color. And it is pinkish, and you can see that it cools pretty quickly because it has tiny little crystals to it rather than big crystals. Basalt is another extrusive igneous rock. So all three of those first ones, obsidian, rhyolite, and basalt, are all extrusive igneous rocks. So we're going to find those at the surface of the earth where lava is cooling down fast. What's different about basalt is that it is formed from oceanic lava or mafic lava. This is also black in appearance like obsidian, but typically you can see it's not very glass-like, and it will have tiny gray or whitish crystals to it. Our next rock is another igneous rock, but this one is intrusive, which means it forms underground, and it cools very slowly. As it's cooling down, there is plenty of time for these chemicals to kind of separate out in the cooling process, and so this rock is multicolored. There's many different colors of crystals going on, many different types of minerals. This is also felsic, so we're going to find this deep underground on continents, and it's going to be multiple colors: pink, white, gray, brown, black. Pretty much all of those can be seen in a typical piece of granite. Gabbro is kind of like granite. It's another intrusive igneous rock, but this one is found in oceans. So this is a mafic rock. So basically, it would be if we had lava that was mafic. So chemically, it was oceanic and mafic rock. If it cools very quickly, it ends up being basalt. If it cools slower underground, it ends up being gabbro. And this is blackish or grayish in color, and you can see larger crystals are typically present, like this picture. Peridotite is an intrusive igneous rock. It's formed from cooling pieces of mantle deep in the earth. So we don't say that this one's felsic or mafic. It is unique. The chemistry of it is actually mantle rock. And typically this is a greenish colored rock. The mineral here is called olivine. That gives it its greenish color. And typically there are some green crystals that can be seen in peridotite. We would expect to find peridotite in areas of deep, where the lithosphere maybe is very thin in the world, so you don't have much of a crust, and you have mantle rock coming reasonably close up to the surface. All right, so those were all igneous rocks. We're going to shift over to some sedimentary rocks. Our first sedimentary rock to talk about is conglomerate. Conglomerate is a sedimentary rock that has kind of pebbles mixed in with it. So you can see here that this is kind of looks like concrete, and it's kind of similar to concrete in the sense that basically it's sort of pebbles that have been cemented together in mud and sand over a long period of time. And typically this is going to form in rivers. All right, another sedimentary rock that we will be looking at here today is limestone. This is a sedimentary rock formed from crushed seashells. This usually is going to form where you would expect to find seashells, so things like shallow oceans and coral reefs. Over long periods of time, basically all these shells kind of crunch together and form limestone. It's typically going to be whitish or yellowish or sometimes kind of brownish in color, but it should be kind of a pale colored rock in general. All right. And now we move over to our first metamorphic rock here. Marble is basically a metamorphic rock that results from limestone that is cooked. So if you smash limestone together in, say, like a mountain range or something, and you have a lot of heat and pressure, crunching this limestone, it will eventually turn into marble. Marble is similar to limestone in that it is whitish, but typically it's going to be smoother than limestone. Limestone's more powdery. Marble is kind of a smoother texture to it, and you will typically see kind of shiny crystals in marble. It's very pretty. Another metamorphic rock is also created by heat and pressure when heat and pressure are applied to layers of mud. Layers of mud, given enough time, will turn into a rock called mudstone. Another word for that is shale. And so when shale is basically heated up and kind of crunched together, it turns into slate. And typically you're going to find this in places where there is a lot of heat and pressure, things like mountains. The appearance of this rock is going to be dark gray. The layers are going to be kind of visible still, but maybe a little bit wavy, wavier than you would find in mudstone or shale. And our final rock that we're going to look at today is gneiss. Basically, gneiss is a metamorphic rock. Can form from a variety of different kinds of rocks. Usually, in certain mountain ranges, you have igneous and sedimentary and all kinds of rocks kind of all smashed together. And sort of the general result of this mass smashing of all these different rocks is something called gneiss. Or maybe it's nice. I don't know how to say that. We're going to go with gneiss. It sounds better. This typically, like I said, is pretty much found all over the place, deep in the earth, where you have all kinds of different kinds of rocks mixing together under heat and pressure or under mountain forming conditions. All right, so that was a lot of rocks. I don't expect you to memorize all 11. I think that's how many there were immediately, and I will give you a handy dandy rock chart that I will throw up on the screen to help you sort of navigate and identify when we are looking at these individual rocks. So if you need to, you can scrub back on the little, what I mean by scrub is you click on the little thing and drag it, and you can go around in the video. If you need to like re-look at some of those old rocks as we're pulling up rocks on the screen, feel free to do that. And then also, I'll always make sure to have the chart up for the questions that I ask you about these rocks. So don't freak out if you're like, man, how was I supposed to memorize all that? It's okay, you can go back, look back through it as you're answering questions, etc., etc. All right, so that covers all of the rocks that we're talking about, but what about the areas that we're supposedly collecting these rocks from, the plate tectonic settings? Let's talk some about what these different settings are like. All right, so we're going to look at 4 different groups of rocks, and it's going to be kind of a mystery. You're going to have to figure out which group of rocks came from which of these 4 locations, and I'm not going to tell you. And the first of our 4 locations is going to be the MidAtlantic Ridge. This is an underwater, basically little mountain range that's forming in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and this forms from a divergent ocean boundary. We've talked a lot about divergent ocean boundaries where you have 2 ocean plates that are separating. Fresh lava comes up in the center and kind of pushes up in the very center of it. So we have new oceanic lava cooling in the center. So we have to think, okay, this is sort of a hypothesis time. What kinds of rocks would you expect to find at this boundary in the middle of the ocean? And I will give you a clue that we're talking about right in the dead center. So even though it's in the ocean, there's not enough time for any sediments to have settled yet. So this is all going to be fresh lava rock. And you have to ask yourself, okay, what kinds of rocks, which kinds of lava rocks would we find in the ocean of the 11 rocks that we have previously discussed? And just so that we're all on the same page, yes, you're going to typically find oceanic igneous rocks here. Something like a basalt or a gabbro would be pretty common rocks to find in the ocean. As you go deeper, you're going to find more extrusive and at the surface, As you go deeper, you're going to find intrusive igneous rocks, the ones that are cooling underground. And at the surface, you're going to find extrusive igneous rocks. All right, our next location is going to be the Cascade Mountains. Cascade Mountains stretch from Northern California all the way up to Canada through Oregon and Washington as well. These mountains have lots and lots of volcanoes, and that is because this is a subduction zone. So what that means is that an ocean plate is subducting underneath a continent, the United States, and in the process, that ocean plate is melting and melting part of the continent. And so the sorts of rocks that we would expect to find would be things that would be erupting from this volcano. So what kinds of rocks would you expect to find in this continental volcanic range? What do you think? Of the previous 11 that we've discussed, what might you find there? All right, our next location is going to be the Himalayan Mountains. This is a continental convergence, and the Himalayan Mountains are the result of basically India, which used to be actually near Africa, basically flew across the Indian Ocean and smacked into Asia, generating these massive, massive mountains in the process. And on the right side, you can kind of see a diagram of what happens when this sort of tectonic boundary occurs. Basically, all the rocks that were once part of the ocean are basically, as the ocean is getting smaller and smaller, they begin to dry up over time, and then eventually all of these layers of rock that were once at the bottom of the ocean kind of get smashed together to result in the mountain range. And you can see that here in the ABC diagram on the right. So what kinds of rocks would you expect to find with all of these sort of previous rocks that were layered down on the bottom of the ocean gets basically smashed together into a mountain? What kinds of rocks do you think you might find there from our previous examples? Yeah, this one is a little bit tricky. Typically, you could find some of the rocks maybe are not completely smashed, so you might find some sedimentary rocks in there that were preserved. And of course, in this sort of smashing process, there's all this heat and pressure on those sedimentary rocks, and we might get some metamorphic rocks. And the last location that we're going to look at is the Llano Uplift, which is in Texas. This is over towards San Antonio, kind of a little bit to the west of San Antonio. And this has a kind of bizarre history. I think the best way to describe this is actually to watch a plate tectonic map go for the last billion years. All right, so this is our map of the world as scientists think it looked about a billion years ago, or 850 million years ago in this case. Can you find Texas? Yeah, I think not. Where is anything? Nothing looks like anything. I can kind of find Australia. I can see sort of Australia shapes. Some of the shapes are, so India's there, but pretty much everything is unrecognizable on this map. I just happen to know from watching it a bunch that Texas is about right here in this map of the world. So Texas would have been here about 850 million years ago. And our oldest rocks in Texas are found from around that time period, maybe around then or a little bit before. As you'll notice, the Texas looks much different than it did today. It's kind of on the edge of an ocean, a shallow ocean, and a continent here. And I'm gonna kind of keep the cursor on this location as we move forward over time here. Let's see what happens to Texas. You can see it's kind of moving. Here it is. Texas is kind of moving, drifting this way. Not too much happening at the moment. But right now, there are some twisting and folding and a pressure applied, and it's right on this kind of edge of an ocean as it's moving. So there was some minor volcanism, volcanoes and mountain forming in the early days of Texas, way back 500 million to a billion years ago. And that's kind of what was going on in that portion of the journey. Let's keep watching it. Move forward here. Yeah, and here you can see that there for a second where that red line showed up, there was a moment there where two continents kind of pushed against each other, probably generated some mountains and hills, that kind of thing. And Texas made its way up here. We'll see it's actually start looking like Texas momentarily. Here it's still kind of in the middle of nowhere, so not too much going on. Still nothing. Oops, smashed again into something there for maybe a second. And for a brief moment right here, where Texas is, we can actually see that it's sort of a shallow ocean temporarily. Oh. And right here, most of Texas, again, is in this kind of shallow ocean area, but you can start seeing it find time. All right, so that's a bit of a strange geologic history, and a lot of places in the world kind of have these similar things. The previous three locations were very active locations. We're talking about places where active lava is going and very active tectonic locations. Texas is not all that active. So a billion years ago, it was on the edge of some conversion boundaries. So you might have some volcanism in mountains back in a long, long time ago in Texas. Around 50 to 100 million years temporarily, it was actually underwater in a shallow ocean. And then in the last 50 million years or so, it's really had no tectonic stress, not much going on here. We do have a few rivers and lakes dumping sediment on top of things. So you might have some sedimentary processes, but that's kind of what's going on in Texas. So with all that happening in the history of Texas, what kinds of rocks would you expect? We had some volcanoes, some mountains, some shallow ocean, and some rivers. So all the rocks that we went over previously, what kinds of rocks would you expect here in Texas? And yeah, it's going to be a little mixture of everything. It's always continental, so even if we had volcanoes a long time ago, we would expect it to be the sort of continental volcanic rock, so things like granite or rhyolite, maybe. The mountain forming stuff, yeah, we might have some slate or gneiss way back in the day. And then more recently, when it was in the shallow ocean, maybe we had some limestone. And with the rivers, maybe we have some conglomerate, something like that. So that's sort of what's going on with Texas. All right, so that kind of gives an overview of all of the content of the lab. And now we're actually going to start looking at the rocks. Your job is going to be identifying the rocks, and then when you look at these groups of rocks together, trying to piece together which location is which based on these groups of rocks. Let's see how it goes.
All right, here is our collection of rocks. So we have 4 different groups of rocks. This is Group A, Group B, Group C, and Group D. And you have to match these 4 groups with the 4 tectonic settings that we just described. This grouping also goes top to bottom, so we can pretend like we found these rocks where the rocks at the top of your screen were found at the surface of the location, and the rocks at the bottom of your screen were found deeper in the Earth's crust. So let's start with Group A. Let's try to figure out where did these rocks in Group A come from. So let's start taking a look at each rock individually. Here's our first rock. And we can kind of see this rock looks a bit like concrete. You get these big pebbles all cemented in here by kind of some smaller sediment. So what rock do you think is this? All right, so that's our rock kind of at our surface of our sediment. So this would be our kind of youngest rock in this area. Here's rock number 2. This is kind of a whitish, brownish rock, very pale in color, very pretty uniform in terms of texture, and it's actually very powdery when you kind of scratch it. All right, so what rock do we think this is? It's also very soft, so the hardness is going to be very low, probably a 3 or 4. So what do you think? So our deeper, as we're going deeper and deeper into the Earth's crust, and again we're still on group A here, this is what we find. So this rock, you can see, has many different colors to it. I can see some pink, some black, some gray, some white, all many different colors. And you can see as I twist it, it's kind of crystally. There's some big large chunks of crystal to it. This is a pretty hard rock. You can actually just barely scratch it with steel, so it's probably a 6 or 7. So what kind of rock do we think this is? And our last rock is a little bit strange. It's not the best sample of it. Really, we're looking at the top portion of this rock. You can kind of see there's multiple layers to it. It's kind of grayish, it's multicolored, and these layers are very kind of bendy and wavy. You can kind of see some of the bends here to it. This rock is also really hard, harder than steel, so that might also help you identify it based off of our rock key and guide. Alright, so what kind of rock do you think this one is? Alright, so that completes all of the rocks for Group A, and now you can try to make your final decision based off of these rocks that you found here and identified. What location would you expect Group A to be? Feel free to scrub back through the video if you need some to re-look at them. Alright, let's move on to Group B here. Our top rock, our surface rock of Group B is this one here. This is a whitish, kind of brownish rock. Again, it's very soft and kind of chalky to the touch. I can almost break it apart with my fingernail. So it's very soft rock, probably about a 3 or so, and it's coincidentally, it's pretty much the same one as this. So what do we think this one is? Alright, our second rock looks very white, and it looks a bit like our first rock, except it's a little bit cleaner looking and nicer looking. If we hold it up to the light, we might even see a little bit of sparkle to it. If it catches just right, I think you can see some sparkles there. This one is slightly harder. It's about a 4 or 5 on the hardness scale when I test it. What do we think for this one? Okay, here's our next rock as we're going deeper. So these are at the surface. As we're going deeper into the earth at this location, we get this kind of dark gray, blackish looking rock. You can see some scratch marks on it. Those aren't naturally occurring, but you can see that if we kind of look at this at the side, that you can see some definite layering to this rock, like so. And especially if we look at it here on this side. But these layers are kind of a little bit bendy and smashed together. So they're not perfect layers, but definitely some layering to it. And this rock is very, very soft. It's about a 3 on the hardness scale. So what do we think for this one? And our bottom rock here is also, you can kind of see some layers here, but they're kind of swirled and mixed together. There you can see the angle. The layers are very uneven, kind of smashed together, multicolored rock. Kind of dominant colors, I would say, with kind of brown and gray. That's what we have going on here. So what do we think for this last rock? This one is also, when I test it, it's very, very hard. Probably harder than steel, I would say. So 6 or 7 or above. All right, so that completes Group B. And you should be able to make a final assessment based off of these rocks, which plate tectonic setting you think Group B is. And again, our choices are the MidAtlantic Ridge, the Cascade Mountains, the Himalayan Mountains, and the Llano uplift in Texas. And if you need to scrub back through the notes to take a look at what those were, feel free to do so. All right, now on to our Group C. Here we only have 3 rocks, so instead of having a 4 deep layer for C and D both, we're just going to have 3 rocks, so 3 layers of rock. So let's look at Group C. The top surface rock here is this black rock. This rock is very, very hard when I try to scratch it. It's typically harder than steel, 6, 7 or so, maybe above. If we look very closely to it, we can see some sparkle to it. It's got some crystals, but they're very, very tiny. So black with tiny kind of gray or whitish crystals to it. All right, so what do we think this one is? And as we're going deeper into the earth, we are going to find this next one. It's a bit like the first one, except we can see that the crystals are bigger. So we have some of that blackish, grayish, dark material, and then also a mixture of these lighter gray or whitish crystals. This one is also very hard. I think it's about a 7-ish in that area as well. What do we think this rock is? And our last rock, this is again not the best example of it, but if we hold this up to the camera and we kind of get the light jingling in on it just right, we can see that this is a little bit greenish in color and that there's actually some kind of green crystals going on here. The crystals are kind of moderately sized, you can see them shining there, and yes, they're very, I think you can tell that that's kind of greenish color this rock is. That's probably the best face. So, greenish color, greenish crystals. I think there should be one obvious choice of what kind of rock this is. So I'll go ahead, identify it. And now we have to ask yourself, for Group C, what tectonic setting do you think we're in? Are we in the MidAtlantic Ridge, Cascade Mountains, the Himalayan Mountains, or the Llano uplift? And last but not least, we have Group D. And again, we have 3 rocks, 3 layers of rocks. The surface rock is this black one. And you can see it's very shiny, smooth looking. The surfaces, we say this rock exhibits patterns of cleavage. So if I hit this rock with a hammer, it will kind of cleave off in these sort of glass-like shards. So it's a very black, glass-like rock. and there are no, it's just completely smooth looking. So what do we think this one is? All right. As we go underneath this one, deeper into the earth, we find this is the same rock, just kind of two iterations. It's a little bit pinkish in color, I would say, pinkish or white. And then in those pinkish color, you can see there's some tiny little crystals. This rock is very, very soft. I can actually almost break it with my fingernails. So we're talking like a 3 or something on the hardness scale. So it's a very soft rock. And the crystals are also kind of pinkish, pretty tiny and shiny. What do we think about this one? It just also goes to show you that even some of the same rocks, they're not all perfectly identical, but pretty similar. Two different locations those came from. All right, and our last rock of the lab is going to be this one. I think this is probably my best example of it. And we can see as we're looking at this rock, we have some colors are, there's a lot of, it doesn't shine the best, but there's some shininess, there's some crystals to it. The crystals are pretty large, and then we have lots of different colors. I would say the overall color is kind of pinkish, maybe brownish, a little bit of flecks of gray, white, black, all in there, mixed together. We can't have duplicates here, so what do we think this one is? And these are all the same. Okay, so that does it. Group D, what do we think? Those were our 3 rocks. Do you think that was the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, underwater in the Atlantic Ocean, the Cascade Mountains, the Himalayan Mountains, or the Yato uplift? All right, so that about covers it for our rock lab here. Hopefully you had an idea and you were pretty confident in which group with which geologic setting. And I hope you learned something about different kinds of rocks and what kinds of rocks you would expect to find at different areas of the earth depending on the plate tectonic environment of those areas. And just make sure that you actually go on to OnRamps and take your OnRamps quiz, talking about my class here, and get credit for this assignment on OnRamps as well. Take it easy.